Welcome to Horrific Stories. Today's tale is a terrifying journey filled with suspense and chilling twists. If you love horror, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. It was a frigid November night in 1987, and the town of Fairhaven, nestled deep in the woods of New England, was blanketed in an unforgiving frost. The temperatures had plummeted to record lows, and the townsfolk huddled indoors, avoiding the biting wind that howled like a grieving spirit. Margaret, a retired nurse, lived alone on the outskirts of the town. Her modest cabin was surrounded by towering pine trees, their snow-laden branches creaking ominously in the gale. That night, as she settled into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea, the power flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped her home, save for the faint orange glow of the fireplace. She wrapped herself in a blanket, prepared for a long, cold night. Just as she began to doze off, a sharp, desperate knock shattered the silence. Startled, Margaret hesitated. Visitors were rare in her isolated home, especially at this hour. The knock came again, louder this time. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Please," a man's voice answered, weak and shaky. "I'm lost and freezing. Help me." Margaret opened the door a crack, letting in a gust of icy air. Standing on her porch was a man in his early 30s, shivering violently. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue, and his clothes were woefully inadequate for the weather. Against her better judgment, Margaret let him in. "You'll freeze to death out there," she said, guiding him to the fire. She offered him a blanket and some hot tea, which he accepted gratefully. As he warmed himself, Margaret noticed his hands. They were frostbitten, with an unnatural black hue creeping up his fingers. She insisted on treating them, but the man seemed oddly reluctant. "It's nothing," he muttered, pulling his hands away. His eyes darted nervously to the windows, as if expecting something or someone to appear. "Were you in an accident?" Margaret asked. "How did you end up out here?" He hesitated before answering. I don't remember. I was driving and then... nothing. Just cold and darkness." Margaret's unease grew. Something about his story didn't add up. But before she could press further, the man grabbed her wrist. His touch was ice cold. "Don't look outside," he whispered urgently. "Whatever you do, don't look outside." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. "Why? What's out there?" "They're looking for me," he said, his voice barely audible. "If they see you, they'll take you too." The wind howled louder, and a strange tapping sound came from the window. Margaret's eyes were drawn to the noise, but the man tightened his grip. "Don't!" he hissed. Terrified, Margaret extinguished the flashlight and sat in the dark with her mysterious guest. Hours passed, the tapping continuing intermittently until it suddenly stopped. As dawn broke, the man stood up. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadier now. "You saved me." Without another word, he walked out the door and disappeared into the forest. Margaret never saw him again, but later that day she heard a chilling report on the news. A car had been found buried in a snowdrift not far from her home. Inside was the frozen body of a man matching the description of her visitor. His hands, frostbitten beyond recognition, were clutching the steering wheel. To this day, Margaret wonders, who or what was the man who came to her door that cold November night? And what would have happened if she had looked out the window? In the remote Alaskan town of Wrangell, winters were a test of endurance. Nights were long, the snow piled high, and temperatures plunged to bone-chilling extremes. But for locals, life went on, even in the darkest months. It was late November when Ellie, a 23-year-old college student, decided to visit her grandparents, who lived in a cabin deep in the wilderness. She borrowed her uncle's snowmobile and set out on the old logging trail that wound through the forest. The journey, though treacherous, was familiar to her. She had made it countless times before. That day, snow fell steadily, and the trail was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the snowmobile's engine. As the light began to fade, Ellie noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the snow, heading in the same direction she was. The tracks were large, barefoot, and unmistakably human. Her stomach tightened. Who would be walking out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no shoes? She slowed her snowmobile, debating whether to turn back. But the thought of her grandparents waiting for her kept her moving forward. The footprints continued for miles, weaving in and out of the trail, sometimes disappearing into the woods. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. As night fell, she finally reached her grandparents' cabin. The warm glow of the windows was a welcome sight, but something was off. The front door was slightly ajar, and the snow on the porch was disturbed, as if someone had been pacing. She rushed inside, calling out, "Grandma? Grandpa?" The cabin was silent, except for the crackling of the fire. The table was set for dinner, and 2 cups of tea sat untouched, steam still rising from them. "Hello?" Ellie called again, her voice trembling. A faint sound came from the back room, a soft tapping, like fingernails on wood. Heart pounding, she crept toward the noise. The door to the back room was shut. Gathering her courage, she pushed it open. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, snow blowing in. On the windowsill were fresh, wet footprints leading out into the dark forest. Panicking, Ellie searched the cabin but found no sign of her grandparents. She locked the doors and windows, bolted them tight, and tried to call for help, but her phone had no signal. The tapping resumed, this time at the front door. Ellie froze. Slowly, she approached and peered through the peephole. A figure stood on the porch, tall and gaunt, its skin pale as the snow. Its hollow eyes met hers, and a twisted smile spread across its face. The creature raised a hand, its long fingers scratching at the door. Then it spoke, in a low, rasping voice. "They let me in. Will you?" Ellie screamed and stumbled back. She grabbed a hunting rifle her grandfather kept by the fireplace, aimed it at the door, and fired. When she opened her eyes, the porch was empty. The footprints were gone. The next morning, a search party found her grandparents deep in the woods, alive but dazed and unable to explain how they had gotten there. They had no memory of leaving the cabin. To this day, Ellie doesn't know what she saw that night, but the footprints still haunt her, and the creature's words replay in her mind. "They let me in. Will you?" In the winter of 1903, the small mining town of Silver Hollow in Colorado was buried under an unforgiving snowstorm. Roads were impassable, and the howling wind carried whispers of legends the old-timers told, stories about the Bride in White, a spirit said to roam the snowy wilderness, searching for something she had lost long ago. Young Samuel Harper, a local trapper, thought little of these tales. Practical and skeptical, he lived alone in a cabin a few miles from town. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, Samuel heard a faint knock at his door. He opened it cautiously, expecting a neighbor in need, but what he saw left him breathless. A woman stood there, wrapped in a tattered white gown, her skin as pale as the snow. Icicles clung to her hair, and her eyes were a piercing blue that seemed to glow in the darkness. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm lost. May I come in?" Samuel hesitated. Her bare feet were sunk into the snow, yet she didn't shiver. Against his better judgment, he stepped aside, letting her in. She sat by the fire, her thin gown dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor. Samuel fetched her a blanket, but when he tried to wrap it around her shoulders, his hand passed through her as though she were made of mist. He froze, his heart pounding. "You live alone," she said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the flames. "It must be lonely." Samuel stammered, unsure how to respond. I'm used to it," he managed. The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You remind me of someone," she said. "My Samuel. He promised we'd be together forever." A chill ran through him. "That's my name," he said, his voice trembling. Her gaze sharpened. "I waited for him on our wedding day, in the snow, but he never came. They found me days later, frozen and alone." Samuel backed away, his mind racing. "You must have the wrong person. I don't know you." Her face darkened. "Don't you?" The cabin's temperature plummeted. Frost crept along the windows, and the fire flickered as if struggling to stay alive. Samuel bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. He turned back to see the woman standing, her figure becoming translucent, her eyes burning with an icy fire. "You broke your promise," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. "I'm not him," Samuel screamed. "I'm not the man you're looking for." The woman's expression softened, her face twisting into sadness. "They always say that," she murmured. Then she dissolved into a swirl of snow and vanished. The next morning, Samuel was found by a search party, half frozen and babbling about the bride in white. His cabin was untouched, except for a single object left behind, an antique gold ring resting on the hearth. Samuel never returned to the cabin. Locals say he left town soon after, haunted by the encounter. To this day, on stormy winter nights, travelers in Silver Hollow claim to see a woman in a white gown wandering the snow, searching for her lost love. And if you listen closely, they say you can hear her whisper, "Samuel, you promised." Thanks for watching Horrific Stories. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more spine-tingling stories. Until next time, keep your lights on and your fears closed.